together through Mighty has brought our institute to the place it is now, to really build on the tremendous engagement that Mighty has built on, and we're very excited to collaborate with them to continue that collaboration with this effort, the MIT Climate and Sustainability Consortium, which launched February of this year. We always applaud ourselves that we've done all of our building of the community over Zoom, and just think about how much opportunity we have when we're now in person. And my co-director, Jeff Grossman, there, along with the director and man with the idea of launching this, Dean Chandrakasan of the engineering school, have really enjoyed the opportunity to work with the companies that we have in doing this. Where's an advancing capability? Did Bob walk off with that, perhaps? I can say next slide. Oh, good. It would be cool if I could blink or something. There we go. Awesome. And so, as you all know well, many companies across the global economy have really set global, aggressive goals in climate. And these goals include being carbon neutral by particular years, or achieving circularity within products, in relationship to humans as well as ecosystems. And these companies have been setting these goals based on their own internal sustainability strategies through science-based targets and working in partnership with industry sectors. And so this is just an example on the left of the folks companies who've committed to 100% renewable, and on the right, companies that have set science-based targets initiatives. And my colleague, Dr. Jason Jay at the Sloan Sustainability Initiative, who put these slides together, every time he does it, he has to update the numbers to increase them and add more. And the sort of level of commitment here is really intense. But much more challenging than setting these goals is going to be figuring out how to actually achieve them. And how to get them to achieve these goals is not always so clear. And also doing so while continuing to innovate and grow as a business is also not so clear. And we like this headline from Fortune last year that said that 2020 was the year of net zero by 2050. Will 2021 be the year we get the details? And part of what we're doing in the Climate and Sustainability Consortium is trying to help get those details and realize the solutions that can help us get those details. Because without these details, we really lose out as industry for opportunities for economic growth. And we like to think about this as a sort of opportunity to build on top of layers of effort and work that relates very much to the theme of the conference in resilience, right? So at the bottom of this, we want to be working towards achieving these details to avoid disaster and the sorts of costs associated with climate change that we all see. But building on top of that is your own opportunities economically within your companies to improve efficiency. Lots of win-win opportunities there. But can we get to a place where we're also spurring new growth, new innovation opportunities in low carbon investments and shifting your business strategies that continue to build on that, and then have that also grow into our own quality of life and joy and well-being and the opportunities that offer. So this is what we want, going from addressing climate abilities to challenges that they're everywhere, and we need to deal with this. And from a risk perspective, up until really supporting health, biodiversity, and environmental justice. So that's really the goal that we have in working together. And here is the set of companies that we've launched with. There's 14 here. We have a 15th signed on. And the key ingredients of the consortium are our member companies. Their sustainability leadership, the teams that they're working with. And what they tell us that they enjoy is working together, identifying opportunities across the global economy. We've on purpose tried to source membership representing the global economy and having opportunities within each sector to look at that. And within this ecosystem of these folks working together, obviously we're also leveraging the MIT ecosystem. We sometimes say we've got the market in the room, we've got the R&D arm in the room to the MIT ecosystem, but also the entrepreneurial and investment opportunity as well. And the goal of the Climate Sustainability Consortium, we work in 3 basic pillars. On the left, I've captured 2 in this idea of defining your sustainability strategies and implementing solutions that help you achieve those goals, but also looking for educational opportunities to strengthen the current work you have, workforce development, et cetera, but also to train the next generation in the context of the students that we have working with us in the consortium. So this is the ecosystem that we get to play with to try to accelerate large-scale real-world solutions across sectors, in meeting the kind of of opportunities that I laid out there. I'd just like to give a couple of the faces of the folks that are involved, just because one thing that we're really proud about, which Bob also said, is the opportunity to work across the entire MIT ecosystem. So this is our faculty steering committee that touches all 5 schools in the college, and I'll give just a couple of highlights about the opportunities that offers us as I go forward. But we also are leveraging students from across the entire institute, and I think we're one of the few organizations on campus that has a student council that's not only across school but also across program, right? You see undergraduates listed there, PhD students, students in the management school, and so pulling these different, the students are just very hungry for it, so pulling these different communities together has been a tremendous opportunity. So that's a little bit of what our goals are and what the opportunity is. I wanted to do kind of a little bit of trying to capture what we get to leverage because of the broad reach that we have across the MIT Institute. And so I sit in the engineering school, I'm in material science, but I get to learn from folks like Roberto Rigoban, who's in the Sloan Sustainability Initiative. And what he's trying to bring to the conversation is help our companies understand, as you're setting goals, as you're setting metrics, is what is measured really managed, right? Are you really getting benefit from what you've chosen to manage and measure, and how does that couple together? And one way he's done this is through looking at benchmarking and metrics development, which is called this Aggregate Confusion Project, which I just love that title. And I'm just going to give you a little sliver of what he's done there that is basically taking environmental social governance rankings and social investment indices that you all conceivably contribute to, and taken the raw data from 64 of those categories, from water, climate, biodiversity, tried to unpack them and compare them, and first understand, what's the variation in those in those categories, and are they really comparable, to understand the different scope of the categories, different measurement of the categories, and weights of these categories. And so this graph is showing the 160 companies with the highest measure of agreement ranked by the absolute mean deviation in the rankings. So we see, from lowest to highest, where there's the least deviation. And I just like to pull out that there's, a bike component company that ranks very low on the ranking. So there's, some little flag for us here that maybe these ratings are not helping us fully understand what's going on within these companies. But more revealing is, here is that same kind of idea, but now I'm plotting the 160 with the most deviation. So this is, we cannot even remotely have a lowest to rank as hiking. You see that the range of dots in this eye chart that I'm showing you cover the entire span of the data. So trying to derive some value from these metrics, that we're all setting benchmarks around, is really challenging. And what Roberto has been able to do through a series of statistical analyses is really remove all this noise that we're seeing in this mess of dots. And he's been able to pose this question: how strongly does environmental, social, and governance performance actually affect staff returns? And he's been able to show through this that if, obviously we need to look at several complementary ratings, but he is able to demonstrate that we have higher expected returns in where there is higher ESG performance. So this is just a sense of what we're trying to do in helping companies set benchmarks and achieve goals in terms of trying to unpack the noise of the metrics and benchmarks you all are setting. We're getting up on time here. So what now I want to tell you about is a little bit of the work that we've done so far. And here is our opportunity, right? Here's global CO2 emissions in 2019. We're looking at sources of fuels and inputs on the left, and then emissions on the right. And you all have seen versions of this Sankey diagram before. And what I'm showing is industry, buildings, transportation, agriculture, and forestry, where the companies that we're working with fit into the industry category, and transportation, and agriculture and forestry, and really trying to understand how do we link those majority contributors in order to identify ways to short circuit solutions that each company is trying to pursue in looking at this. So this is the framing of the opportunity and how we try to work to prioritize what we'll be developing solutions around. And so the very specific work that we've been doing since we launched in February is to prioritize a set of areas that we would focus in through a set of workshops, looking at carbon capture through natural sinks and engineered solutions, looking at circularity in organic and inorganic materials, and looking also at sustainable supply chains and decarbonizing tough transportation. And I'm just going to show you a little bit of an example, in particular looking at natural carbon sinks, because what's really interesting about nature-based solutions to carbon removal, we all know in order to meet these goals that we're setting for ourselves in 2030, 2050, that carbon removal is inherent, is part of those solutions, that we have to be able to have a robust way of realizing. So sort of science-based opportunities to leverage those is one thing that the companies have found valuable to interact with the MIT community about. But it's also one of these things that's both a part of our company's direct supply chains, for example, Cargill, but is also something that is broadly of interest because of the opportunity that carbon markets offer. So that, being able to have that conversation in concert across the economy is what our opportunity is here. And so what does that look like in practice? This is up here on the top, Charlie Harvey in the EAPS department here, Earth Atmospheric Planetary Sciences Department, and he's sharing with our companies this input on planetary boundaries, but who we have in the room company-wise, goes across that spread, but also the departments at MIT and the centers that Bob mentioned. And what that lets us do is identify where there is synergies and where there is opportunities to work together. And this is just an output of one of these workshops that we held in June, where we had a graphic recorder who's pulling out some of the key themes that you start to see here in terms of how do we effectively harness the natural ways that plants interact in the environment, how do we take into account indigenous knowledge, engage with local communities, and so we're identifying the set of prioritized activities that our member companies are interested in working together to try to accelerate that. But we get to do that with the experts from MIT helping us guide company investments, helping inform where there is uncertain science. And I'm going to illustrate one of this through one of these climate grand challenges that Bob alluded to. And so here, the research questions are, where does carbon go in the natural sinks? How do we enhance those natural sinks? And how can we best store more carbon across a portfolio of ecosystems? And as I said, the companies are interested in what sorts of strategies should we invest in to try to enhance that, but also, do we take part in carbon markets, and how do we do that, and what are robust ways of doing that? And so we can look at what the opportunities are to enhance those, enhance natural carbon sinks in hydrologically controlled coastal peatlands that's happening in work at MIT, but also looking at carbon management in forests with Craft, who's our membership and who's part of our membership, and then also in agricultural soils, where we're understanding what is the possibility in abandoned croplands. And where MIT comes into play in here is not only understanding how do we develop work with the natural systems in order to enhance this, but also how do we measure, how do we manage, how do we monitor, given the costs and given the challenges of being local farmers on the ground who need to be able to actually make use of these strategies to measure and manage the soil carbon and implement best practices in regenerative agriculture. So this is just one little, or it's not little, one example of the opportunity that we have in having the research and development at MIT in the same space as companies who are trying to actively invest and figure out where to prioritize across these opportunities. Another example that's very near to, excuse me, I forgot one more thing. So what that turns into what the consortium is working on is basically fourfold, and this is the set of activities we're undertaking as it relates to nature-based solutions to carbon removal. So as I said, monitoring approaches where we're looking at data, technology, and approaches for monitoring soil health and carbon sequestration. As folks know, the real opportunity in nature-based sinks has to do with co-benefits, so identifying and quantifying dimensions of value to the land, where we can then use a carbon market or a carbon price to try to accelerate and realize those benefits. But co-benefits are an important part of that. And then, as I said, working with farmers and foresters on the ground to synthesize technological and social factors that are informing whether or not practices are being adopted. And then finally, the kind of overall governance structures, and this is very related to the opportunities in carbon markets, but linked to regenerative transitions. And so within that one pathway, this one opportunity of the set that I talked about that we've done workshops around, this is the area of focus of what we're looking at. I'll just briefly mention one other, which has to do with material circularity, and this is related to the research that goes on in my group as well. So the challenge in material circularity, as folks know, is that we are not very circular. Lots of losses in this system. On the left, I'm showing a Sankey diagram that's associated with plastic, where the circularity is just this tiny little loop up here, where the vast majority is going to landfill and leakage and incineration, and folks know this story well. And even for metals, just showing an example for copper here, as extracted by mass from mines, but then the set of red bars here are the series of losses associated with that. So even higher value materials, there's lots of loss of lossiness in these systems. And from my research and from the work of the consortium, we know that in talking with our members, a huge part of this has to do with the quality of the stream, right? The nature of the quality of how we recover these streams and how the requirements we have or how they're used leaves a lot to be desired and leads to these challenges in circularity. And so what we can work on and what we've identified in order to look at that are, what is the value of transparency and traceability in these systems to try to help in flows of materials, to try to enhance the free flow of movement of material that is of sufficient quality, but also improvement of that quality. We're investing in technologies that will sort and upgrade and develop the right infrastructure in order for those materials to be recovered, but also that those are governed by or incented by the right kinds of metrics and the right kinds of policy. So the consortium opportunity in the circularity space has to do with leveraging data, leveraging the kinds of source synced opportunities that circularity strategies can offer, but to do so together, to do so with the needs and interests of the companies at hand. And the work that we're doing within each of the themes that I've just given you two examples of about 6 across these various areas is done by a set of postdoctoral fellows that we've hired that are part of the consortium, but also working very closely with faculty throughout campus, some of whom I've mentioned here briefly. And they come from a broad range of backgrounds, social sciences, the chemists and engineers, to be the glue that links the companies with the efforts on campus. And so why do we want to work on these together? What's the benefit of working on these problems together? This is one small example in the biofuel space, where I'm taking that same Sankey diagram that I showed you before of what our key opportunity is in terms of sources and emissions, and particularly looking at use of biofuels in a transition within tough to decarbonize strategies in transportation. So this is what the final area I wanted to mention briefly. So as, for example, the aviation sector is looking to transition to biofuels and sustainable aviation fuels, that's going to have an impact not only within the rest of the transportation sector in trucking, aviation, and maritime shipping, but it's also obviously going to have a significant impact on land use in the agricultural and forestry sector. And so being able to have that conversation, like we're going to do tomorrow morning, in the same room of, what are the quality needs? What does a transition look like to use of those feedstocks? What is the availability? What is going to be the competition for those sectors? So that's the link that we see between transport and agriculture, but it's also linked to the ways in which that would then compete with biofuel sources for other energy sources, and not only that, but how it would compete with potential feedstocks in the biomaterial space. So this just brief link between nodes and branches just related to biofuels helps motivate why we would want to try to tackle these problems together, and why doing it in the same room potentially identifies key stumbling blocks earlier on or key opportunities to move forward more quickly. is a blown up version of what I just showed you, right? So this is one example of biofuels, and this is what we look like across the whole consortium of all the different kinds of problems we tackle. Obviously not going to go through that, but I just wanted to illustrate this is why we feel we need to work together. The sustainability challenges are complicated. We need to do so, with the system in the room. So with that, you can join the conversation with us tomorrow. This afternoon, Jeremy Gregory, who's the executive director of the consortium, will be available for questions at around 3:30 in the break. But you're also welcome to join us at an entrepreneurial session that we're hosting tomorrow at 11. But once this conference is over, then you can join us for wine and cheese to meet the fellows that I mentioned and hear in more detail about the set of work that we're doing within each of these pathways around carbon removal, around sustainable supply chains and decarbonizing tough sectors, and around material circularity. So with that, I'm happy to take some questions if there's some time. The one tomorrow is in Sandburg. Folks know where that is? You could send out a link. Yeah, E52. Yes, great. Yeah, so that is the specific work that we're doing there is a couple of different forms. So one has to do with looking at abandoned farmland. So identifying where are there plots of land that are either have been abandoned and then could be the soil could be prepared such that it would be a better sink, and the sort of rewildment, as it's called, rewilding of lands is one opportunity there, which is always there are some cultural challenges there because it's from a farmer's perspective that the goal there is to leave the land be, and so that often looks like a lazy farmer culturally. So that's something that is why taking into account the local stakeholders' concerns and perceptions is important. But there's also a couple of other things. One has to do with the kinds of crops that are grown, so perennial crops, and how the folks in both environmental engineering at MIT, but also in Earth and Atmospheric and Planetary Sciences, do plant genomics, where we would have the ability to do DNA markers to understand what are the particular biomes of plants that are better at uptaking, and then how do we grow the crops such that they have the best soil capture, soil carbon sequestration potential, and that's linked with what the cycling of those use of that cropland is. So it takes place both at the genetics level in terms of the crops themselves, the plants themselves, but also in the agricultural practices. And this is all in the space of regenerative agriculture. Maybe actually a fourth option has to do with being more precise in the agricultural practices. Use of drones to identify where yields are low, where water irrigation needs to be improved, and that will improve overall productivity of land, therefore requiring less of it in net. So those are several different ways in which the nature-based solutions are being investigated, linked to agricultural practices. Yeah, I can. Yep. I can take them. Thanks, Corey. Yeah. So. We are looking to add industry members, and so happy to talk with folks about that now, and once there's a break. But also, as I said, Dr. Jeremy Gregory will be around in this afternoon. The membership opportunities that we're looking for has to do with kind of building on those themes that I mentioned. So folks who are interested in those companies that have interest in those themes. And are parts of the value chains that are relevant to what I talked about, in particular to fill gaps that we have in the automotive sector, for example. So we have lots of kind of strategy that we've thought through on that. We'd love to talk about that. And I can share details with folks on the nature of the membership itself. But it's a flat fee, 3 years, and the goal, and as folks who are part of the consortium now would attest, it's high touch. We ask a lot of folks to help make sure what we're doing is helpful and productive for you. So we've been talking with we have several company members that were at COP26, and I think in particular, I think that the main theme that has come out of the conversations thus far has been related to the nature-based solutions, and that's part of why I spoke to that as much as I did, both on the opportunity side for folks whose supply chains do not directly touch that agricultural or forest practices, but also for those who do. So I think I don't think I would say that it changes the research directions as much as amplifies and highlights the themes that we've chosen to work on, but it is something that we're in conversation with. And I would say the same thing that Bob did, that there's, I forget his exact wording, but it's easy to knock it, I think he said, but folks who have found this kind of positive direction, that slow and steady progress is necessary and possible. So that's how I would answer that.